Part 1. The Psychology of Pain. Have you ever wondered why humans are so terrifyingly good at causing pain? You see, right now, somewhere in a museum, there's a rusty iron chair covered in 500 sharp spikes, and it's not even the worst thing we're going to talk about today. Welcome to the darkest corner of human innovation, where creativity met cruelty in ways that would make even the most hardened horror writers squirm. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh great, another gore fest video. But stick around, because this isn't just about the blood and screams. This is about understanding something fundamental about human nature, something that might just help us prevent history from repeating itself. Before we dive into the devices themselves, we need to understand something crucial. Torture wasn't just about causing pain. It was about power, control, and sometimes, bizarrely enough, about public entertainment. Let me tell you about a particularly creative fellow named Ruthless of Athens. In 570 BC, this inventive gentleman had what he thought was a brilliant idea. He approached Phalaris, the tyrant of Agrigentum, with a unique proposal. A hollow bronze bull that could roast people alive while converting their screams into musical notes. Yes, you heard that right. A musical instrument powered by human suffering. The fascinating or disturbing part? Ruthless was so proud of his invention that he couldn't stop bragging about how the victim's screams would be transformed into beautiful music through carefully designed acoustic tubes. But here's where karma enters the chat. Phalaris, impressed by the craftsmanship but disgusted by the inventor's enthusiasm, decided that Ruthless should have the honor of testing his own creation. Talk about product testing gone wrong. The brazen bull became known as the Sicilian bull, and it's a perfect example of how torture devices weren't just tools. They were works of twisted engineering genius. But here's something that might surprise you. The most effective torture methods weren't always the most elaborate ones. Sometimes, the simplest things proved the most devastating. Take Chinese water torture, for instance. No spikes, no blades, no fire. Just a single drop of water falling on your forehead. Sounds harmless, right? Wrong. The consistent dripping on the same spot, hour after hour, day after day, would drive people to the brink of madness. The anticipation of each drop became worse than the drop itself. It was psychological warfare at its finest, or worse, depending on how you look at it. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of torture's history isn't the devices themselves. It's how methodically they were developed. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully engineered to prolong suffering while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. Ancient torturers were essentially dark scientists. They studied anatomy, psychology, and even physics to maximize pain while minimizing the risk of accidental death. They understood that the threat of torture was often more effective than torture itself. Think about that for a moment. These weren't just sadists with tools. They were researchers of human suffering, pushing the boundaries of what the human body and mind could endure. And here's where things get really interesting. Many of these torture methods were developed during periods of great scientific and artistic achievement. The Renaissance, that golden age of art and innovation, also gave us some of the most sophisticated torture devices in history. But before we dive into those Renaissance innovations, let me tell you about something even more disturbing: how public torture became a form of entertainment in medieval Europe. And trust me, what happened in those town squares makes modern reality TV look like children's programming. Stay with me, because in part 2, we're going to explore how torture became a spectator sport and why people would pack their lunches to watch these gruesome shows. Sometimes, the darkest parts of history have the most to teach us about human nature. Part 2, the public spectacle. Picture this. It's a sunny morning in medieval London, and families are packing picnic baskets. But they're not heading to a park. They're going to watch someone be tortured to death. If you think modern humans are desensitized to violence, let me introduce you to your ancestors' favorite form of entertainment. You see, public torture wasn't just about punishment. It was the Netflix of the Middle Ages, complete with seasonal schedules and favorite performers. Take the breaking wheel, for example. This wasn't just any torture device. It was the heavyweight champion of public executions. Picture a giant wooden wheel with a condemned person strapped to it. The executioner would systematically break every major bone in their body, weaving their still-living victim through the spokes of the wheel. But here's the truly bizarre part. Skilled executioners were celebrities. Franz Schmidt, a 16th-century executioner in Nuremberg, was so famous he had groupies. People would literally follow him around town, begging for autographs. Imagine that on a modern resume. Professional bone breaker with a strong social media following. Schmidt kept a diary, and let me tell you, it reads like a medieval Instagram feed. He meticulously documented every execution, complete with humble brags about his technique. Today's quartering went especially well. Hashtag bless hashtag executioner life. But the real showstoppers were the rats. Yes, rats. The rat torture was like a twisted version of dinner theater. They'd place a cage of hungry rats against the victim's body, then heat the cage from above. The rats, trying to escape the heat, would burrow through the only exit available, the human body. The audience would place bets on how long the victim would last. Some even had favorite rats they'd cheer for. It was essentially the Roman Colosseum, but with rodents instead of lions. Speaking of audience participation, let's talk about the scold's bridle. This was basically medieval crowd work. It was a metal mask with a spike that pressed down on the tongue, used primarily on women accused of gossip or nagging. The fun part? The victim would be paraded through town, while people threw rotten vegetables at them. Think of it as a medieval version of a roast comedy show, except nobody was laughing, except the audience. But perhaps the most theatrical of all torture methods was the lead sprinkler. Picture a holy water sprinkler, but instead of water, it sprinkled molten lead or boiling oil. The executioners would often put on a show, blessing their victims with molten metal while reciting mock prayers. Talk about production value. Now, you might be wondering, how did people justify turning torture into entertainment? Well, they did what humans always do. They convinced themselves it served a greater purpose. The church claimed it cleansed souls. The state said it deterred crime. The people told themselves they were participating in justice. But really, they were just doing what we still do today, finding socially acceptable ways to indulge our darkest curiosities. And speaking of curiosities, wait until you hear about the pair of anguish. Actually, let me save that for part 3, because it involves a mechanical engineering feat that would make Leonardo da Vinci both impressed and horrified. But before we get there, here's something to ponder. While we might think we're more civilized now, consider this. How different is our fascination with true crime documentaries and horror movies from our ancestors' attraction to public executions? Maybe the only thing that's changed is that we've moved the spectacle behind screens. We're still watching. We're just doing it from a safer distance. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll explore the most ingenious and disturbing torture devices ever created. And trust me, the pair of anguish is just the appetizer. Part 3, the engineering of agony. Remember when I mentioned Leonardo da Vinci earlier? Well, during the same era that gave us the Mona Lisa and the Sistine Chapel, other artists were crafting masterpieces of their own torture devices that combine precision engineering with nightmarish creativity. Let's talk about the pair of anguish. Imagine a metal pair with intricate gears and segments. At first glance, it could pass for a beautiful mechanical ornament, but this was no decoration. When inserted into any orifice of the body, yes, any orifice, a simple turn of the screw would cause the pair to slowly expand, segment by segment. The engineering was precise enough that the torturer could control exactly how much damage to inflict. It was basically the first analog pain control device. Think of it as a medieval volume knob, except instead of adjusting sound, it adjusted suffering. But that's amateur hour compared to the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg. Now, most people think they know about the Iron Maiden, that sarcophagus-looking thing with spikes inside. But here's what they don't tell you. The spikes were mathematically positioned to miss vital organs. The designers weren't just sadists, they were anatomists. They calculated the exact length and position of each spike to pierce the body but avoid quick death. It was essentially a human pincushion designed by someone who aced their anatomy classes. Speaking of precision engineering, let's discuss the Spanish tickler. Despite its playful name, this was essentially the world's most horrifying back scratcher. Made with dozens of sharp claws arranged in rotating wheels, it could strip flesh from bone with surgical precision. The engineering was so precise that it could be adjusted to remove exactly one layer of skin at a time. But perhaps the most ingenious and terrifying device was the Spanish donkey. Picture a triangular wooden horse with a very sharp top ridge. The victim would be forced to ride it with weights tied to their feet. The genius part? The designer understood the physics of pressure perfectly. The sharper the top ridge and the heavier the weights, the more intense the agony. Some models even had a rocking mechanism, because apparently regular torture wasn't interactive enough. But let's talk about something that didn't require any complex engineering at all: scaphism, or the boats. The Persians simply tied someone between two boats, force-fed them milk and honey until they got diarrhea, then left them floating on a stagnant pond. Nature did the rest. Insects would lay eggs in their body and, well, let's just say it could take weeks to die. It was basically a primitive version of biological warfare. No gears, no spikes, just a thorough understanding of how to use nature's most unpleasant processes against someone. Now, for something truly mind-bending, the Chinese lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts. This wasn't just torture, it was anatomical artistry. The executioner would make precisely placed cuts, removing small pieces of flesh over days or weeks. They had maps showing exactly where to cut to cause maximum pain while keeping the victim alive. These anatomical charts looked like something you'd find in a medical school, except they were used for exactly the opposite of healing. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all these devices wasn't their engineering or effectiveness. It was the documentation. You see, torturers kept detailed notes. They recorded every scream, every plea, every physiological response. They wrote manuals, drew diagrams, and even had apprenticeship programs. In fact, some of our understanding of human anatomy comes from their observations. It's a disturbing reminder that knowledge isn't inherently good or evil. It's how we use it that matters. And speaking of how we use knowledge, in our final part, we're going to explore something even more chilling: how these medieval torture techniques influence modern interrogation methods. Because sometimes, the past isn't as far behind us as we'd like to think. Stay tuned for part 4, where we'll discover how these ancient methods evolved into something perhaps even more sinister: psychological torture. And trust me, what the mind can do to itself makes all these physical devices look almost merciful. Part 4, the modern evolution. Welcome to the present day. Put away the medieval devices, because we're about to explore something far more terrifying: how the art of torture evolved from physical pain to psychological destruction. You might think we've left the horrors of the past behind, but here's the uncomfortable truth: we didn't stop torturing. We just got better at hiding the scars. Let me introduce you to something called white torture. Imagine a room. Everything is white: the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Your clothes are white. Your food is white. Even the light is white. No sounds, no colors, no human contact. Just endless, maddening whiteness. Iranian political prisoners who experienced this reported that after just a few days, they began to hallucinate. After a few weeks, some couldn't remember their own names. No blood, no screams, but arguably more effective than any medieval device. But that's just the beginning. Remember sleep deprivation? It's one of the oldest torture methods in history, but modern torturers turned it into a science. They discovered that after 48 hours without sleep, the pain receptors in your body become hypersensitive. After 72 hours, you start hallucinating. After 96 hours, your mind begins to fragment. Then there's sensory manipulation. Too much noise, too little noise, random patterns of light and dark, It sounds almost benign compared to the rack or the wheel. But these techniques can break a person's mind without leaving a single mark on their body. Modern torturers learned something crucial from their medieval predecessors. The anticipation of pain is often worse than pain itself. But instead of showing their victims the torture devices, they created something far more terrifying: uncertainty. You never know when they'll come for you. You never know what they'll do. The human mind, trying to prepare itself. Imagine scenarios far worse than reality. You become your own torturer. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Remember how medieval torturers kept detailed records? Well, their modern counterparts had entire research programs. They studied psychology, neuroscience, and human behavior to develop methods that would break the human spirit without leaving evidence. They learned that isolation, unpredictability, and total control over someone's environment could achieve what no physical torture could: the complete destruction of a person's sense of self. And the truly terrifying part? These methods are still in use today, often disguised under euphemisms like enhanced interrogation or stress positions. The medieval torturer's workshop has been replaced by sterile rooms and scientific reports. The executioner's hood has been replaced by lab coats and clipboards. So what do we learn from this journey through humanity's dark expertise in causing suffering? Perhaps it's that human creativity is a double-edged sword. The same ingenuity that can create beautiful art and revolutionary technology can also devise ways to break body and spirit. Or maybe it's something more fundamental: that understanding our capacity for cruelty is the first step in ensuring we never repeat these dark chapters of history. Because here's the most important lesson: torture isn't just about the methods or the devices. It's about the choice to see fellow humans as something less than human. And that's a choice we can still make today, with or without the medieval devices. The real question isn't whether we've evolved beyond torture. It's whether we've evolved beyond the mindset that made it possible in the first place. Think about that the next time you hear someone say, "Humans are more civilized now." Because sometimes the most important history lessons aren't about how far we've come, but about how vigilant we must remain to avoid going backwards. Remember, the past isn't just something that happened. It's something that can happen again unless we learn from it. And perhaps that's the most torturous thought of all.